Hello and welcome to the Bill Douglas Cinema Museum podcast series on item histories. So for this series, we're going to be taking a look at items from the Bill Douglas Cinema Museum. The museum is located on the University of Exeter campus. And we'll be taking items from the museum and providing sort of context for them, so discussing their histories and their importance to the museum. We are student interns, Chloe and Jess. Hi, Chloe.
Hi, Jess.
And we'll be taking you through the first two of these short podcasts. We will then be interviewing academics on items which reflect their own fields of interest in the coming weeks. So stay tuned for those. To begin, though, I decided to analyse some Picturegoer magazines. Nice. So they're the items I chose. I chose one from the 1920s, one from the 30s, 40s, and then 50s. And I sort of used them to understand audience perceptions of stardom, audience perceptions of film culture, and how these magazines appeal to their target audience. So from reading through Lisa Stead's book, which is called After the Pictures, this studies film paratext and their influence. She talks a lot about how film media and the surrounding discourse was mainly consumed by women, particularly between the period between the First and Second World War. Women were seen as Stead puts it, lucrative targets in the trade press. So these were who were generally reading the Picturegoers. Obviously, this isn't an exact, exclusive, target audience. But women who had time and money to see the films and engage with their paratext were the target. These were also working class women. So these were women who were working, who were ambitious. And as I'm sure you'll say in your podcast, Chloe, it's to do with aspirational. Yes. The Picturegoer is often to do with aspirational people. So you've got a woman who's often reading this and looking at these film stars as something of escapism, but also ambition. Yeah. You know? So I thought I'd begin with looking at a few adverts because I think these, to be fair, can tell you a lot about the people that are reading the museum. Do you think so? So I thought we'd have a look at this advert. This is from the January 1925 version. So this, for example, has a picture of a woman at the top and it says on there, how to get lustrous wavy hair. So a lot of these adverts are to do with hair, makeup, beauty products. Yeah. And these were quite often, targeted towards women. Yeah. For this one, for example, we have this face cloth. This is from the 1930s. Yeah. But this is a face cloth and it says on the advert, made for women who can judge quality. So it's quite, yes. So a lot of them say things along those lines. Yeah. Oh, and often they have a picture of a woman on the advert or a picture of a film star. Yeah. And it will say, if you want hair like Mary Pickford, if you want hair like Clara Bow, then use this product, you know. And that kind of, shows who's buying the magazines.
Yeah. Were there any adverts for men?
There were some. So it's not exclusively women. There are often some shaving adverts. Yeah. There's one to do with things you can take to stop baldness and losing your hair. And that's often got men on them. So there are some. But you can definitely tell the majority of these adverts are within the Picturegoers are for women. Yeah. So this is the 1920s version. This is January 1925. If you feel this, Chloe, you can be you can feel that.
Goodness.
So
it's heavy.
It's heavy, isn't it?
Thick.
It's thick and it's really good quality paper. This is probably the most sort of well kept, if anything, version of the Picturegoer because these are the oldest, which is interesting. The paper's thicker and the magazine itself is thicker because it's a monthly magazine rather than a weekly magazine. As I say, this is from January 1925, and this is very much the height of silent film fame, of course. And in it, I picked out a few articles from each that I thought would be particularly interesting to look at. There's a few which I think. These pictures, for example, they have pictures in the middle of all of these, which are just stills of film stars. Yeah. And they often have on them describing what these film stars look like. So blue eyes, brown hair. Yeah. And this will be because they've only ever seen them black and white. So it will be, there's descriptions of these stars. Yeah. The other particularly interesting article, which I think speaks a lot to the era of the Picturegoer that we're looking at here, there's an interesting article called The Business of Being a Star. This is written by a woman called Adele Whitley Fletcher. And as you'll find out throughout, Chloe, the amount of women writers does decrease throughout the Picturegoers, actually, which is interesting because
it feels like an anti-trend. You'd think it would increase as time goes on.
Absolutely, you would. Absolutely. And it actually does the opposite. So in this is mainly to do with Mary Pickford, Clara Bow, a bit about Douglas Fairbanks, Harold Lloyd and Charlie Chaplin. And these are people who, as the article says, manage their own companies and are versed in high finance. These are the stars of whom I write. She's talking here about how being a successful film star is a lot to do with the way you manage yourself. So business acumen. So she's talking about how having a good knowledge of business and the industry itself really helped film stars at this time to be successful. And it's really interesting. This is written about women by women. And I think that it again speaks to how, in the early years, a lot of the film industry itself was dominated by women, which is super interesting.
Happy International Women's Day.
Absolutely. It's International Women's Day today, isn't it? Yeah. So let's move on to the 1930s. Nice, yeah. So this one, I have a feel of this one, Chloe.
The complete opposite.
The absolute opposite, isn't it?
It's so thin.
It's thin, it's flimsy. Yeah. And this is to do with it going from a monthly magazine to a weekly magazine. So it's shorter for that reason, in that they couldn't produce as much information. Yeah. So it's a shorter magazine, but it's also made with acid. So the paper quality itself decreases through the decades. Yeah. And these are cheaper to make. Yeah. And so that's probably why they made them. But the paper itself is more sort of flimsy and can sort of, be easily broken.
It doesn't preserve as well as like the 1930s.
It doesn't preserve. Absolutely, it doesn't. So this particular Picturegoer is from July 25th, 1931. It has Vin Gibson on the cover. And there's a particularly interesting article, I thought, called The High Price of Fame, it's called. Now, this is an interesting high cost of film fame. Yeah. So this is by a man called Reg Mortimer. And he's talking about the film fame robs you of your privacy, he says. It tears down the curtains of your private life. Every normal man and woman holds something sacred. Home, marriage, children, friendship. But for stars, nothing is sacred. So he's criticising the lack of privacy that film stars are getting and the idea of how you have to give so much of yourself to the media. Now, this is really interesting to me because if you flick forward, literally, Chloe, maybe 3 or 4 pages, would you say? Forward, there's a double page spread called Hot from Hollywood gossip, from the sets. And that's really interesting to me and it talks about, in that section, it talks about Garbo's new romance, so Greta Garbo's new romance, and paints Douglas Fairbanks as this Hollywood Samaritan because he stopped to help some cars that had got into a car crash. And he's branded as Mary Pickford's husband. So it's sort of, going back pretty much on what it just said, which I think is really interesting. Exactly. Yes. Okay, so if we move to the 1940s. Nice. For the 1940s, again, feel the paper. This one is even thinner.
It's like, it almost feels like it's just a cover, a couple of pages. And that's
it, absolutely. And this is more to do with the war. Because as the country entered the Second World War, it began sort of nationwide paper rationing. Right. So this is, physically, they didn't have enough paper, so they had to use less. So that's to do with this, but again, it's quite flimsy material. So in this one has some interesting context in terms of lots of more pictures, like actual pictures. Yes,
photographs. Yeah.
Lots of more photographs. A little bit of more colour in some of these. There's some colour, as you can see. Oh, wow. So it's starting to sort of move into that era. There's a really interesting article in it that Cecil B. DeMille wrote. It's called In Defense of Myself. So it's him almost giving a retrospective on his own career, which I think is a really interesting concept. But that's kind of that's the only really meaty story in it. Everything else is pretty much a lot of gossip, a lot of like context stuff, which is understandable with the war, but
I kind of wish they did that now, actors looking back on themselves and their career.
It's a very interesting thing. It also promotes his new film, which actually, I don't think the new film, it's called Northwest Mounted Police. It doesn't, but it's a really interesting thing. There's also, there's a bit about film reviews, which are quite common in a lot of these. Yeah. But the bit that I thought was really fascinating was this section called Letters from Our Readers. So you could send in your opinions on film stars and your opinions on film in general, and you could win money for having almost the most interesting or the most thought out opinion. And the winner of this week, or one of the winners this week, he won 10 shillings. And it was from this person who said, all for love. So it says, whatever the current cycle in Hollywood, we can always be sure of one thing: everything will stop for love. And it talks about how, it says, there's a quote here, which says the career woman who is as strong as any man, and he expresses anger that's what he's seeing. So he's saying that in action films the woman would distract, or the male lead and thing, and it's really interesting. And he says, I'm tired of it. I'm sick of having this perfectly good gangster film spoilt because the detective has to waste precious fact of film telling his girl how much he loves her. And it's really interesting because, again, that's an interesting thing because often the target audience for a lot of these films was women. And so I wonder if that's sort of interesting. Anyway, so then there is another section little here that just says comfort for the troops. So it's interesting in the war context that they're asking for readers to send comfort for the troops, including board games, things to do on the front line, and sports equipment. So sending that to the front line to try and help the soldiers sort of, pass the time, which is really interesting. But so it's definitely a product of its time.
Yeah.
The final one that I wanted to have a look at was from the 1950s. This is from the 26th of March, 1955. As you can feel, again, the paper itself is a bit thicker, isn't it?
Much
than
thicker.
The one from April 5th, 1941.
Not as thick as the 1920s.
Absolutely not.
Still thicker than the previous years.
Still the same use of paper. It's still a weekly, of course.
Yeah.
And this one you can see on the front, it says it's 3.5 shillings.
Oh,
so it's interesting that it seems to have sort of, increased in price as you go along.
Yeah.
So on this one, we've got a more, I would say, flashy.
I'd agree.
Would you agree with that? Yeah. You can see that this magazine is trying to sell itself, whereas I think the other ones didn't need to, perhaps, especially the one from like 1925, for example.
100%.
There is, on the front, you can even read here, are you a Tony Curtis enthusiast? If so, turn to page 7 quick.
Yeah.
You've got, Vera Ellen tells you how to marry a millionaire.
Yeah.
These are like flashy, it's lots of colour, isn't it? It's lots
so much
of
colour.
Adverts. It's as the magazine, it just tells you to buy it, rather
100%.
than focusing on film itself.
Yeah.
It focuses a lot more on gossip. An example of this is there's a 2-page spread here on their wedding between Lauren Bacall and Humphrey Bogart.
Yes.
A whole 2-page spread on it. Nothing to do with film, but it's definitely to do with film culture.
Yes.
And then, as I say, there's the section on how to marry a millionaire.
Yeah.
What you also see in this section is the coming of TV.
Yes.
The TV, the amount of households that had TV
TVs,
at this stage was increasing and increasing. And there's sort of TV wives turns up again. This is to do with like new dramatic TV series and sort of, they've got a section here called They Call This Man Exciting, and they've got pictures of these TV stars. And I think that's really interesting to see almost a shift in media consumption as well, and a shift in to do with sort of what they're trying to sell. That, as I say, they're selling gossip.
Yeah.
There's very little on actual film context. Yeah. Anyway, so overall, what I've looked at from these, I think, is tracking an idea of film culture and an idea of who's the target audience, as we say, working class women, aspirational women. And I think that the Picturegoers illustrate that perfectly. Amazing. Is what I would say.
I've actually got a question.
Oh, please.
Why would you say like these items, the Picturegoers specifically, are important to the museum?
That's interesting. I think the museum itself is not only about film content, but film context. That's very clear when you look at the museum. I think when you sort of look around it, you see that it's as much about film paratexts and audiences and audience trends than it is about the film stars themselves. Yeah. And I think that's why Picturegoers in particular can tell us so much. They're vital in looking at audience perceptions. They teach us about film, and not only about film, but also who's watching them.
Yes.
Why they're watching them,
Yes.
what they're looking for. And I think that's definitely why the museum finds the Picturegoers so valuable. There's such a huge collection of Picturegoers in the museum.
So
there are boxes and boxes. So if anyone wants to read, come down. Come along and have a read. Get a book in the reading room.
Perfect. Thank you, Jess.
Thank you so much.